We men of earth have here the stuff of paradise, we have enough. We need no other thing to build the stairs into the unfulfilled, no other ivory for the doors, no other marble for the floors, no other cedar for the beam and dome of man's immortal dream. Here on the paths of every day, here on the common human way, is all the busy gods would take to build a heaven, to mold and make new Edens. Ours the stuff sublime to build eternity in time. Not only are we here in the world to build something, but we are here to build upon the will of God, in obedience to His purpose and design. The truth of a will within and behind everything is a truth which has far too little place in our lives, hence our impatience, our restlessness, and our sense of futility. Yet this truth of the will of God as final has been the strength and solace of man in all his great days. The first fact of experience, if not the last truth of philosophy, is that the world has a mind of its own, which we call the will and purpose of God. Manifestly the only man who builds rightly is the man who builds with due regard for the laws, forces, and conditions of the world in which he lives. Not one of us would trust ourselves to a house which had been built casually and haphazard. We demand of a wall that it shall have been built with respect to the center of gravity of this earth, and to the position of the polar star. Our work, if it is to be of any worth, must be in harmony with the nature of things, and this is equally true when we think of the house of the Spirit not built with hands, but which, nonetheless, we are set to build in the midst of the years. Here also we build wisely only when we build in harmony with the will of God as we believe and see it. All history enforces the truth that there is a will, holy and inexorable, which in the end passes judgment upon our human undertakings. Men do not make laws, they discover them. Faith in God advises us, warns us, to regard the revelations of the moral, as well as the physical, will of God, else our proudest fabric will totter to ruin. Therefore we are here in the world to build upon the will of God with the help of God, invoking His help in words of prayer and worship, but also in our efforts and acts of obedience, and proving ourselves worthy of that help, and retaining it, by keeping in the midst of it by humble fidelity. A wise man, especially a Freemason, if he knows his art, will rebuke himself and recall himself from any vagrant lapse or prolonged neglect, lest he go too far. Here is a matter which even the best of us too often forget. God no more wishes us to live without His aid than He wishes us to live without air. He is the breath of our spirit. Truly has it been said that the final truth about man is not that way down in the depths he is alone, but that in the depths he is face to face with God. Long ago it was said, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it." What the psalmist means is that the great things in the world are not accomplished by man, either by his anxieties or by his ingenuities. By these lower, lesser faculties, by cunning, by cleverness, we may achieve small and passing things. The truth is, rather, that the great things, the enduring things, are accomplished, not, indeed, apart from us, and yet not wholly as the result of our efforts, by one wiser than ourselves, by whom we are employed in the fulfillment of a design larger than we have planned and nobler than we have dreamed. Those of our race who have wrought the most beautiful and enduring works confess themselves to have been used by a hand and a will other than their own, as if caught up into the rhythm of one vast life that moves and cannot die. Here is no abstract and unreal platitude, but a truth, a fact, a source to which we may apply a daily test, and which we need to invoke if we are to face the difficulties and embarrassments, the tragedies, of these our days and years. Even the strongest of us need such resources the better to confront the issues of the day, as well as to face the vaster problems and mysteries which lie on all the horizons of our life. Such is the foundation of Freemasonry, and the faith by which it makes us builders upon the will of God and by His help, and brothers one of another. Upon this foundation is erected an elaborate allegory of human life in all its varied aspects, the lodge a symbol of the world in which man lives, moves and goes forth to his labor. Initiation our birth into a world in which we are to learn morality and charity. If counted worthy, passing out of youth into manhood with its wider knowledge and heavier responsibilities. And finally, if we have integrity and courage, the discovery that we are citizens of eternity in time. An ideal world ruled by love, wisdom, strength, and beauty. It is a great day for a young man when Masonry reveals its meaning to him, unveiling its plan of life, its purpose, and its prophecy of a temple of brotherhood. A great Freemason of Scotland, who recently climbed ahead to work up in the dome of the temple, left us a legacy of inspiration and instruction in a book which is at once a mentor and a memorial. Speculative Masonry, by A.S. McBride, Lodge Progress, Glasgow. Even now it is a classic of our literature, a light to lead his brethren toward the truth after he has vanished from among us. The book is wise rather than clever, beautiful rather than brilliant. But there is hardly a page that does not yield some insight to illumine, some epigram to haunt the mind. The beauty of the book is inwrought, not decorative, in the build of its thought even more than in the turn of its sentences, and still more in its spirit in which spiritual vision and practical wisdom are blended. There are passages of singular nobility, as witness this one on the great landmark. Why is Masonry here, in this world of selfishness and strife? Wherefore has it been developed, amid war and incessant conflict, along the lines of peace and love, and so marvelously molded and developed that in every land it is now known and by every race made welcome? Has all this been done that it may live for itself alone? No, there, on its trestle-board is the plan of the great architect, and its mission is to work out that plan. Out of the rough hard quarries of a quarreling humanity it has to build a temple of brotherhood and peace. This temple is the great landmark, the highest and grandest ideal of Masonry. To build, strengthen and beautify it, we must bring in the aid of all the arts and sciences, apply every resource that civilization and progress can give us, and exercise all the powers and gifts with which we have been endowed. What nobler work can we be engaged in, brethren? Yet, how far we are, as a rule, from understanding it. We seem to be groping in the dark. Yet, it is ignorance more than unwillingness that hinders the work. Like the ingenious craftsman at the building of the temple at Jerusalem, we appear to be without plan and instruction, while, in reality, our plan and instruction he in the work itself. Then, like him, we shall someday have our reward, and will gratefully exclaim, "Thank God, I have marked well." Brothers and Builders, Joseph Fort Newton, Chapter 1, The Altar. Brought to you by Masonic Audiobook Library, read by Kwame. A Masonic lodge is a symbol of the world as it was thought to be in the olden time. Our ancient brethren had a profound insight when they saw that the world is a temple, overhung by a starry canopy by night, lighted by the journeying sun by day, wherein man goes forth to his labor on a checkerboard of lights and shadows, joys and sorrows, seeking to reproduce on earth the law and order of heaven. The visible world was but a picture or reflection of the invisible, and at its center stood the altar of sacrifice, obligation, and adoration. While we hold a view of the world very unlike that held by our ancient brethren, knowing it to be round, not flat and square, yet their insight is still true. The whole idea was that man, if he is to build either a house of faith or an order of society that is to endure, must imitate the laws and principles of the world in which he lives. That is also our dream and design. The love of it ennobles our lives, it is our labor and our worship. To fulfill it we, too, need wisdom and help from above. And so at the center of our lodge stands the same altar, older than all temples, as old as life itself, a focus of faith and fellowship, at once a symbol and shrine of that unseen element of thought and yearning that all men are aware of and which no one can define. Upon this earth, there is nothing more impressive than the silence of a company of human beings bowed together at an altar. No thoughtful man but at some time has mused over the meaning of this great adoring habit of humanity, and the wonder of it deepens the longer he ponders it. The instinct which thus draws men together in prayer is the strange power which has drawn together the stones of great cathedrals, where the mystery of God is embodied. So far as we know, man is the only being on our planet that pauses to pray, and the wonder of his worship tells us more about him than any other fact. By some deep necessity of his nature, he is a seeker after God, and in moments of sadness or longing, in hours of tragedy or terror, he lays aside his tools and looks out over the far horizon. The history of the altar in the life of man is a story more fascinating than any fiction. Whatever else man may have been, cruel, tyrannous, or vindictive, the record of his long search for God is enough to prove that he is not wholly base, not altogether an animal. Rites horrible, and often bloody, may have been a part of his early ritual, but if the history of past ages had left us nothing but the memory of a race at prayer, it would have left us rich. And so, following the good custom of the men which were of old, we set up an altar in the lodge, lifting up hands in prayer, moved thereto by the ancient need and aspiration of our humanity. Like the men who walked in the gray years agone, our need is for the living God to hallow these our days and years, even to the last ineffable homeward sigh which men call death. The earliest altar was a rough, unhewn stone set up, like the stone which Jacob set up at Bethel when his dream of a ladder, on which angels were ascending and descending, turned his lonely bed into a house of God and a gate of heaven. Later, as faith became more refined, and the idea of sacrifice grew in meaning, the altar was built of hewn stone, cubical in form, cut, carved, and often beautifully wrought, on which men lavished jewels and priceless gifts, deeming nothing too costly to adorn the place of prayer. Later still, when men erected a temple dedicated and adorned as the house of God among men, there were 2 altars, one of sacrifice, and one of incense. The altar of sacrifice, where slain beasts were offered, stood in front of the temple. The altar of incense, on which burned the fragrance of worship, stood within. Behind all was the far withdrawn holy place into which only the high priest might enter. As far back as we can go, the altar was the center of human society and an object of peculiar sanctity by virtue of that law of association by which places and things are consecrated. It was a place of refuge for the hunted or the tormented, criminals or slaves, and to drag them away from it by violence was held to be an act of sacrilege since they were under the protection of God. At the altar marriage rites were solemnized, and treaties made or vows taken in its presence were more holy and binding than if made elsewhere, because their man invoked God as witness. In all the religions of antiquity, and especially among the peoples who worshipped the light, it was the usage of both priests and people to pass round the altar, following the course of the sun, from the east, by way of the south, to the west, singing hymns of praise as a part of their worship. Their ritual was thus an allegorical picture of the truth which underlies all religion, that man must live on earth in harmony with the rhythm and movement of heaven. From facts and hints such as these, we begin to see the meaning of the altar in Masonry, and the reason for its position in the lodge. In English lodges, as in the French and Scottish rites, it stands in front of the master in the east. In the York rite, so called, it is placed in the center of the lodge, more properly a little to the east of the center, about which all Masonic activities revolve. It is not simply a necessary piece of furniture, a kind of table intended to support the Holy Bible, the square, and compasses. Alike by its existence and its situation, it identifies Masonry as a religious institution, and yet its uses are not exactly the same as the offices of an altar in a cathedral or a shrine. Here is a fact often overlooked, and we ought to get it clearly in our minds. The position of the altar in the lodge is not accidental, but profoundly significant. For, while Masonry is not a religion, it is religious in its faith and basic principles, no less than in its spirit and purpose. And yet it is not a church. Nor does it attempt to do what the church is trying to do. If it were a church, its altar would be in the east and its ritual would be altered accordingly. That is to say, Masonry is not a religion, much less a sect, but a worship in which all men can unite, because it does not undertake to explain, or dogmatically to settle in detail, those issues by which men are divided. Beyond the primary, fundamental facts of faith, it does not go. With the philosophy of those facts, and the differences and disputes growing out of them, it has not to do. In short, the position of the altar in the lodge is a symbol of what Masonry believes the altar should be in actual life, a center of union and fellowship, and not a cause of division, as is now so often the case. It does not seek uniformity of opinion, but it does seek fraternity of spirit, leaving each one free to fashion his own philosophy of ultimate truth. As we may read in the Constitutions of 1723, a Mason is obliged, by his tenure, to obey the moral law, and if he rightly understands the art, he will never be a stupid atheist, nor an irreligious libertine. But though in ancient times Masons were charged in every country to be of the religion of that country or nation, whatever it was, yet 'tis now thought more expedient only to oblige them to that religion in which all men agree, leaving their particular opinions to themselves. That is, to be good men and true, or men of honor and honesty, by whatever denominations or persuasions they may be distinguished, whereby Masonry becomes the center of union, and the means of conciliating true friendship among persons that must have remained at a perpetual distance. Surely those are memorable words, a Magna Charta of friendship and fraternity. Masonry goes hand in hand with religion until religion enters the field of sectarian feud, and there it stops, because Masonry seeks to unite men, not to divide them. Here, then, is the meaning of the Masonic altar and its position in the lodge. It is, first of all, an altar of faith, the deep, eternal faith which underlies all creeds and overarches all sects. Faith in God, in the moral law, and in the life everlasting. Faith in God is the cornerstone and the keystone of Freemasonry. It is the first truth and the last, the truth that makes all other truths true, without which life is a riddle and fraternity futility. For, apart from God the Father, our dream of the brotherhood of man is as vain as all the vain things proclaimed of Solomon, a fiction having no basis or hope in fact. At the same time, the altar of Masonry is an altar of freedom, not freedom from faith, but freedom of faith. Beyond the fact of the reality of God, it does not go, allowing every man to think of God according to his experience of life and his vision of truth. It does not define God, much less dogmatically determine how and what men shall think or believe about God. Their dispute and division begin. As a matter of fact, Masonry is not speculative at all, but operative, or rather cooperative. While all its teaching implies the fatherhood of God, yet its ritual does not actually affirm that truth, still less make it a test of fellowship. Behind this silence lies a deep and wise reason. Only by the practice of brotherhood do men realize the divine fatherhood, as a true-hearted poet has written. No man could tell me what my soul might be. I sought for God, and he eluded me. I sought my brother out and found all three. Hear one fact more, and the meaning of the Masonic altar will be plain. Often one enters a great church, like Westminster Abbey, and finds it empty, or only a few people in the pews here and there, praying or in deep thought. They are sitting quietly, each without reference to others, seeking an opportunity for the soul to be alone, to communicate with mysteries greater than itself, and find healing for the bruisings of life. But no one ever goes to a Masonic altar alone. No one bows before it at all except when the lodge is open and in the presence of his brethren. It is an altar of fellowship, as if to teach us that no man can learn the truth for another, and no man can learn it alone. Masonry brings men together in mutual respect, sympathy, and goodwill, that we may learn and love the truth that is hidden by apathy and lost by hate. For the rest, let us never forget what has been so often and so sadly forgotten, that the most sacred altar on earth is the soul of man, your soul and mine, and that the temple and its ritual are not ends in themselves, but beautiful means to the end that every human heart may be a sanctuary of faith, a shrine of love, an altar of purity, piety, and unconquerable hope. Brothers and Builders by Joseph Fort Newton. Chapter 2. The Holy Bible. Upon the altar of every Masonic lodge, supporting the square and compasses, lies the Holy Bible. The old, familiar book, so beloved by so many generations, is our volume of sacred law and a great light in Masonry. The Bible opens when the lodge opens, it closes when the lodge closes. No lodge can transact its own business, much less initiate candidates into its mysteries, unless the book of holy law lies open upon its altar. Thus the book of the will of God rules the lodge in its labors, as the sun rules the day, making its work a worship. The history of the Bible in the life and symbolism of Masonry is a story too long to recite here. Nor can anyone tell it as we should like to know it. Just when, where, and by whom the teaching and imagery of the Bible were wrought into Freemasonry, no one can tell. Anyone can have his theory, but no one can be dogmatic. As the craft labored in the service of the church during the cathedral building period, it is not difficult to account for the biblical coloring of its thought, even in days when the Bible was not widely distributed, and before the discovery of printing. Anyway, we can take such facts as we are able to find, leaving further research to learn further truth. The Bible is mentioned in some of the old manuscripts of the craft long before the revival of Masonry in 1717, as the book upon which the covenant, or oath, of a Mason was taken, but it is not referred to as a great light. For example, in the Harleian manuscript, dated about 1600, the obligation of an initiate closes with the words, "So help me God," and the holy contents of this book. In the old ritual, of which a copy from the Royal Library in Berlin is given by Krause, there is no mention of the Bible as one of the lights. It was in England, due largely to the influence of Preston and his fellow workmen, that the Bible came to its place of honor in the lodge. At any rate, in the rituals of about 1760 it is described as one of the three great lights. No Mason needs to be told what a great place the Bible has in the Masonry of our day. It is central, sovereign, supreme, a master light of all our seeing. From the altar it pours forth upon the east, the west, and the south its white light of spiritual vision, moral law, and immortal hope. Almost every name found in our ceremonies is a biblical name, and students have traced about 75 references to the Bible in the ritual of the craft. But more important than direct references is the fact that the spirit of the Bible, its faith, its attitude toward life, pervades Masonry, like a rhythm or a fragrance. As soon as an initiate enters the lodge, he hears the words of the Bible recited as an accompaniment to his advance toward the light. Upon the Bible every Mason takes solemn vows of loyalty, of chastity, and charity, pledging himself to the practice of the brotherly life. Then as he moves forward from one degree to another, the imagery of the Bible becomes familiar and eloquent, and its music sings its way into his heart. Nor is it strange that it should be so. As faith in God is the cornerstone of the craft, so, naturally, the book which tells us the purest truth about God is its altar light. The Temple of King Solomon, about which the history, legends, and symbolism of the craft are woven, was the tallest temple of the ancient world, not in the grandeur of its architecture but in the greatest of the truths for which it stood. In the midst of ignorant idolatries and debasing superstitions, the temple on Mount Moriah stood for the unity, righteousness, and spirituality of God. Upon no other foundation can men build with any sense of security and permanence when the winds blow and the floods descend. But the Bible is not simply a foundation rock, it is also a quarry in which we find the truths that make us men. As in the old ages of geology, rays of sunlight were stored up in vast beds of coal, for the uses of man, so in this old book, the light of moral truth is stored to light the mind and warm the heart of man. Alas, there has been more dispute about the Bible than about any other book, making for schism, dividing men into sects. But Masonry knows a certain secret, almost too simple to be found out, whereby it avoids both intolerance and sectarianism. It is essentially religious, but it is not dogmatic. The fact that the Bible lies open upon its altar means that man must have some divine revelation, must seek for a light higher than human to guide and govern him. But Masonry lays down no hard and fast dogma on the subject of revelation. It attempts no detailed interpretation of the Bible. The great book lies open upon its altar and is open for all to read, open for each to interpret for himself. The tie by which our craft is united is strong, but it allows the utmost liberty of faith and thought. It unites men, not upon a creed bristling with debated issues, but upon the broad, simple truth which underlies all creeds and overarches all sects, faith in God, the wise master builder, for whom and with whom man must work. Herein our gentle craft is truly wise, and its wisdom was never more needed than today, when the churches are divided and torn by angry debate. However religious teachers may differ in their doctrines, in the lodge they meet with mutual respect and goodwill. At the altar of Masonry, they learn not only toleration but appreciation. In its air of kindly fellowship, man to man, they discover that the things they have in common are greater than the things that divide. It is the glory of Masonry to teach unity in essentials, liberty in details, charity in all things, and by this sign its spirit must at last prevail. It is the beautiful secret of Masonry that all just men, all devout men, all righteous men are everywhere of one religion, and it seeks to remove the hoodwinks of prejudice and intolerance so that they may recognize each other and work together in the doing of good. Like everything else in Masonry, the Bible, so rich in symbolism, is itself a symbol, that is, a part taken for the whole. It is a symbol of the book of truth, the scroll of faith, the record of the will of God as man has learned it in the midst of the years, the perpetual revelation of himself which God has made, and is making, to mankind in every age and land. Thus, by the very honor which Masonry pays to the Bible, it teaches us to revere every book of faith in which men find help for today and hope for the morrow. For that reason, in a lodge consisting entirely of Jews, the Old Testament alone may be placed upon the altar, and in a lodge, in the land of Muhammad, the Koran may be used. Whether it be the Gospels of the Christian, the Book of Law of the Hebrew, the Koran of the Mussulman, or the Vedas of the Hindu, it everywhere Masonically conveys the same idea, symbolizing the will of God revealed to man, taking such faith and vision as he has found into a great fellowship of the seekers and finders of the truth. Thus Masonry invites to its altar men of all faiths, knowing that, if they use different names for the nameless one of 100 names, they are yet praying to the one God and Father of all. Knowing, also, that while they read different volumes, they are in fact reading the same vast book of the faith of man as revealed in the struggle and tragedy of the race in its quest of God. So that, great and noble as the Bible is, Masonry sees it as a symbol of that eternal, ever-unfolding book of the will of God which Lowell described in memorable lines. Slowly the Bible of the race is writ, and not on paper leaves nor leaves of stone. Each age, each kindred, adds a verse to it, texts of despair or hope, of joy or moan. While swings the sea, while mists the mountain shroud, while thunder's surges burst on cliffs of cloud, still at the prophet's feet the nations sit. None the less, while we honor every book of faith in which have been recorded the way and will of God, with us the Bible is supreme, at once the mother book of our literature and the master book of the lodge. Its truth is inwrought in the fiber of our being, with whatsoever else of the good and the true which the past has given us. Its spirit stirs our hearts, like a sweet habit of the blood. Its light follows all our way, showing us the meaning and worth of life. Its very words have in them memories, echoes and overtones of voices long since hushed, and its scenery is interwoven with the holiest associations of our lives. Our fathers and mothers read it, finding in it their final reasons for living faithfully and nobly, and it is thus a part of the ritual of the lodge and the ritual of life. Every Mason ought not only to honor the Bible as a great light of the craft, he ought to read it, live with it, love it, lay its truth to heart and learn what it means to be a man. There is something in the old book which, if it gets into a man, makes him both gentle and strong, faithful and free, obedient and tolerant, adding to his knowledge virtue, patience, temperance, self-control, brotherly love, and pity. The Bible is as high as the sky and as deep as the grave. Its two great characters are God and the soul, and the story of their eternal life together is its everlasting romance. It is the most human of books, telling us the half-forgotten secrets of our own hearts, our sins, our sorrows, our doubts, our hopes. It is the most divine of books, telling us that God has made us for himself, and that our hearts will be restless, unhappy and lonely until we learn to rest in him whose will is our peace. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good, and what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy strength, and with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. Therefore all things whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Pure and undefiled religion before God and the Father is this: to visit the fatherless and widows in their affliction, and to keep himself unspotted by the world. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved, we have a building of God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Brothers and Builders by Joseph Fort Newton. Chapter 3. The Square, brought to you by Masonic Audiobook Library. Read by Kwame. The Holy Bible lies open upon the altar of Masonry, and upon the Bible lie the square and compasses. They are the three great lights of the lodge, at once its divine warrant and its chief working tools. They are symbols of revelation, righteousness, and redemption, teaching us that by walking in the light of truth, and obeying the law of right, the divine in man wins victory over the earthly. How to live is the one important matter, and he will seek far without finding a wiser way than that shown us by the great lights of the lodge. Nearly everywhere in our ritual, as in the public mind, the square and compasses are seen together. If not interlocked, they are seldom far apart, and the one suggests the other. And that is as it should be, because the things they symbolize are interwoven. In the old days when the earth was thought to be flat and square, the square was an emblem of the earth, and later, of the earthly element in man. As the sky is an arc or a circle, the implement which describes a circle became the symbol of the heavenly, or skyey spirit in man. Thus the tools of the builder became the emblems of the thoughts of the thinker. And nothing in Masonry is more impressive than the slow elevation of the compasses above the square in the progress of the degrees. The whole meaning and task of life is there, for such as have eyes to see. Let us separate the square from the compasses and study it alone, the better to see its further meaning and use. There is no need to say that the square we have in mind is not a cube, which has 4 equal sides and angles, deemed by the Greeks a figure of perfection. Nor is it the square of the carpenter, one leg of which is longer than the other, with inches marked for measuring. It is a small, plain square, unmarked and with legs of equal length, a simple tri-square used for testing the accuracy of angles, and the precision with which stones are cut. Since the tri-square was used to prove that angles were right, it naturally became an emblem of accuracy, integrity, tightness. As stones are cut to fit into a building, so our acts and thoughts are built together into a structure of character, badly or firmly, and must be tested by a moral standard of which the simple tri-square is a symbol. So, among speculative Masons, the tiny tri-square has always been a symbol of morality, of the basic tightness which must be the test of every act and the foundation of character and society. Greater than from the beginning of the revival in 1717, this was made plain in the teaching of Masonry, by the fact that the Holy Bible was placed upon the altar, along with the square and compasses. In one of the earliest catechisms of the craft, dated 1725, the question is asked: how many make a lodge? The answer is specific and unmistakable. God and the square, with 5 or 7 right, are perfect Masons. God and the square, religion and morality, must be present in every lodge as its ruling lights, or it fails of being a just and truly constituted lodge. In all lands, in all rites where Masonry is true to itself, the square is a symbol of righteousness, and is applied in the light of faith in God. God and the square. It is necessary to keep the two together in our day, because the tendency of the time is to separate them. The idea in vogue today is that morality is enough, and that faith in God, if there be a God, may or may not be important. Some very able men of the craft insist that we make the teaching of Masonry too religious. Whereas, as all history shows, if faith in God grows dim, morality become a mere custom, if not a cobweb, to be thrown off lightly. It is not rooted in reality, and so lacks authority and sanction. Such an idea, such a spirit, so widespread in our time, and finding so many able and plausible advocates, strikes at the foundations, not only of Masonry, but of all ordered and advancing social life. Once let men come to think that morality is a human invention, and not a part of the order of the world, and the moral law will lose both its meaning and its power. Far wiser was the old book entitled All in All and the Same Forever, by John Davies, and dated 1607, though written by a non-Mason, when it read the reality and nature of God in this manner. Yet I this form of formless deity drew by the square and compasses of our creed. For, inevitably, a society without standards will be a society without stability, and it will one day go down. Not only nations, but whole civilizations have perished in the past, for lack of righteousness. History speaks plainly in this matter, and we dare not disregard it. Hence the importance attached to the square or virtue, and the reason why Masons call it the great symbol of their craft. It is a symbol of that moral law upon which human life must rest if it is to stand. A man may build a house in any way he likes, but if he expects it to stand and be his home, he must adjust his structure to the laws and forces that rule in the material realm. Just so, unless we live in obedience to the moral laws which God has written in the order of things, our lives will fall and end in wreck. When a young man forgets the simple law of the square, it does not need a prophet to foresee what the result will be. It is like a problem in geometry. Such has been the meaning of the square as far back as we can go. Long before our era, we find the square teaching the same lesson which it teaches us today. In one of the old books of China, called the Great Learning, which has been dated in the 5th century before Christ, we read that a man should not do unto others what he would not have them do unto him. And the writer adds, this is called the principle of acting on the square. There it is, recorded long, long ago. The greatest philosopher has found nothing more profound, and the oldest man in his ripe wisdom has learned nothing more true. Even Jesus only altered it from the negative to the positive form in his golden rule. So, everywhere, in our craft and outside, the square has taught its simple truth which does not grow old. The Deputy Provincial Grand Master of North and East Yorkshire recovered a very curious relic, in the form of an old brass square found under the foundation stone of an ancient bridge near Limerick, in 1830. On it was inscribed the date, 1517, and the following words, strive to live with love and care upon the level, by the square. How simple and beautiful it is, revealing the oldest wisdom man has learned and the very genius of our craft. In fact and truth, the square rules the mason as well as the lodge in which he labors. As soon as he enters a lodge, the candidate walks with square steps round the square pavement of a rectangular lodge. All during the ceremony, his attitude keeps him in mind of the same symbol, as if to fashion his life after its form. When he is brought to light, he beholds the square upon the altar, and at the same time sees that it is worn by the master of the lodge, as the emblem of his office. In the north cast corner, he is shown the perfect ashlar and told that it is the type of a finished mason, who must be a square man in thought and conduct, in word and act. With every art of emphasis, the ritual writes this lesson in our hearts, and if we forget this first truth, the lost word will remain forever lost. For Masonry is not simply a ritual, it is a way of living. It offers us a plan, a method, a faith by which we may build our days and years into a character so strong and true that nothing, not even death, can destroy it. Each of us has in his own heart a little tri-square called conscience, by which to test each thought and deed and word, whether it be true or false. By as much as a man honestly applies that test in his own heart, and in his relations with his fellows, by so much will his life be happy, stable, and true. Long ago the question was asked and answered, Lord, who shall abide in thy tabernacle? He that walketh uprightly, and worketh righteousness, and speaketh the truth in his heart. It is the first obligation of a Mason to be on the square, in all his duties and dealings with his fellow men, and if he fails there he cannot win anywhere. Let one of our poets sum it all up. It matters not whate'er your lot or what your task may be, one duty there remains for you, one duty stands for me. Be you a doctor skilled and wise, or do your work for wage, a laborer upon the street, an artist on the stage. One glory still awaits for you, one honor that is fair, to have men say as you pass by, that fellow's on the square. Ah, here's a phrase that stands for much, 'tis good old English, too. It means that men have confidence in everything you do. It means that what you have you've earned and that you've done your best, and when you go to sleep at night untroubled you may rest. It means that conscience is your guide, and honor is your care. There is no greater praise than this. That fellow's on the square. And when I die I would not wish a lengthy epitaph. I do not want a headstone large, carved with fulsome chaff. Pick out no single deed of mine, if such a deed there be, to grave upon my monument, for those who come to see. Just this one phrase of all I choose, to show my life was fair. Here sleepeth now a fellow who was always on the square. Brothers and Builders by Joseph Fort Newton. Chapter 4. The Compasses, brought to you by Masonic Audiobook Library. Read by Kwame. In our study of the square we saw that it is nearly always linked with the compasses, and these old emblems joined with the Holy Bible, are the great lights of the craft. If the lodge is an oblong square, and built upon the square, as the earth was thought to be in olden time, over it arches the sky, which is a circle. Thus earth and heaven are brought together in the lodge, the earth where man goes forth to his labor, and the heaven to which he aspires. In other words, the light of revelation and the law of nature are like the 2 points of the compasses within which our life is set tinder a canopy of sun and stars. No symbolism can be more simple, more profound, more universal, and it becomes more wonderful the longer one ponders it. Indeed, if Masonry is in any sense a religion, it is universe religion, in which all men can unite. Its principles are as wide as the world, as high as the sky. Nature and revelation blend in its teaching. Its morality is rooted in the order of the world, and its roof is the blue vault above. The lodge, as we are apt to forget, is always open to the sky, whence come those influences which exalt and ennoble the life of man. Symbolically, at least, it has no rafters but the arching heavens to which, as sparks ascending seek the sun, our life and labor tend. Of the heavenly side of Masonry, the compasses are the symbol, and they are perhaps the most spiritual of our working tools. As has been said, the square and compasses are nearly always together, and that is true as far back as we can go. In the 6th book of the Philosophy of Mencius, in China, we find these words: a master mason, in teaching apprentices, makes use of the compasses and the square. Ye who are engaged in the pursuit of wisdom must also make use of the compass and the square. Note the order of the words. The compass has first place, and it should have to a master mason. In the oldest classic of China, the Book of History, dating back 2,000 years before our era, we find the compasses employed without the square. Ye officers of the government, apply the compasses. Even in that far-off time, these symbols had the same meaning they have for us today, and they seem to have been interpreted in the same way. While in the order of the lodge the square is first, in point of truth it is not the first in order. The square rests upon the compasses before the compasses rest upon the square. That is to say, just as a perfect square is a figure that can be drawn only within a circle or about a circle, so the earthly life of man moves and is built within the circle of divine life and law and love which surrounds.